oldest statesman of megaliths, is that fair to say?
Not megalith.
He was here before us all. He's a megalith himself. In fact, John has been a few talks at the conferences right at the very beginning, where there was Kevin and myself, and John did a talk right back in that 17 years ago in Windermere, our first conference. So it's still going.
Yeah.
He's also been editing the Northern Earth magazine for 32 years, and he's going to stop doing that at Christmas, is that right?
Yes, Christmas will be my last one, and then it's passing on to somebody else who's younger, more technically competent, and but has the same values as the old Northern Earth.
Yeah, today's talk is Journey Between the Worlds, taking the ancestors home.
Thank you, Neil.
Yeah. So welcome John back.
Right. Well, hi there. Now I feel like a really vintage person. Yeah. Now, my talk today is about soul journeying between worlds in our own local landscapes along a class of trackways known as corpseways or coffin routes. Now, these are pathways that grew up at the start of the parish system and persisted for centuries as customary routes along which the deceased were carried to their funerals and burial at their parish church. They were generally carried on foot, or perhaps with a horse when means allowed, for they crossed all kinds of terrain and gradients in making their way from the deathbed to the church. They are often broadly the same as other church routes or kirk gates, all reflecting the centralisation inherent within the Christian parish system. If you were a Christian, and we're talking Catholic in most of the currency of corpseways, then your spiritual well-being depended on the local parish system, because the parish priest, in principle, undertook the curation and care of all their souls in the parish. Now, to put them into historical setting, when corpseways dropped out of use is hard to ascertain, but is likely to have been on a case-by-case basis according to the remoteness and ruralness of a parish. But also changes in Christian allegiances from Catholicism to Protestantism, church to chapel, played a major part. Protestants were allergic to what they thought of as superstition and ritual, and the nonconformists were fundamentally so. So most corpseways were probably being supplanted by wheeled processions on highways from the 18th century into the 19th, with extra incentive from better road maintenance and general infrastructure. Now, one major difference between these corpseways and other paths in the landscape, however, is that they were implicitly transcendental. They were paths which both living humans and human souls travelled together for a shared purpose. And they left a trace of what they were in both the material and the esoteric landscape. Nowadays they're little known, but they have a special characteristic that commends them to mysterious earth. They are sacred routes, and they exist on a liminal plane that is affirmed in the kind of folklore that is often encountered on them. A corpseway, after all, is just a step on the way to the next world. Now, it's not so easy to trace these old routes today. People have tended to allow themselves to forget such memento mori, such reminders of death. And one-time names like Coffin Lane obviously lack appeal as an address when the developers step in. Here is where local history research is needed. It's on maps and in manorial records that we can find references to the corpseways of the 16th and 17th centuries to the 18th centuries. Maps should be the easy option, but as I said, much of the evidence has gone. Yeah, here's one example showing the old course road to Hebden Bridge. Course is an old variant for corpse, as we can see here. As for manorial records, it's a real slog going through such archives. I don't know if anybody's done it, but they're handwritten in antiquated English at best. And if you're looking for corpseways, you'll not have a high strike rate. They're just something you encounter along the way if you're doing wider study into historical route and wayfaring. But in any case, once you have a collection of historical mentions, it is no longer research that can be done indoors, or on a screen, or even in a library. It demands an embodied experience of the paths in their landscape. In other words, you have to get your boots on if you want to try and trace and experience these liminal trails. And then they will leave a deep impression. So at this point, I should point out that I haven't done the manorial archives myself, but I know someone who has. Murray Seacombe, who was doing his PhD on early modern trackways around the Calder Valley of West Yorkshire, and knew of my interest in the more folkloric side of local history, provided these comments for me. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, Murray gave me a few pointers to corpseways, and it seemed to me to be a very appropriate project for the pandemic, that dismal time when Memento Mori was all around us every day on every news broadcast. Now, my project involved the Upper Calder Valley in West Yorkshire, around Halifax and Heptonstall, joining the dots that my friend had supplied. While the project was, in effect, just a small-scale mapping endeavour of paths travelled by local souls, living and dead, its meaning and implications are far wider than just this patch of the Pennines. As Alan Garner, who has done in-depth local studies of law and history around Alderley Edge, as he once remarked, the parochial is the universal. So it is in that sense that I illustrate today's talk from my own patch. Now, it hasn't happened in Hebden Bridge or yet, but some corpseways have become heritage walks, such as the Rydal Grasmere Coffin Path and the Keld-Mooka Corpse Road in Swaledale. And they are beginning to attract more interest among local historians, as local history buffs have started to realise the importance of folk tradition and what we might recognise as ritual activities in the communities we study. Much of local history to date has concerned itself with industrial and church history, local families and their lands, and that kind of materialist history. But it is when local history turns to local folklore and folk culture that it complements the study of everything else, and it validates the community that they are studying. The popularity of local history studies nowadays strikes me actually as an attempt to hold on to and respect those past generations and their folkways in the place where we live. And as such, I see local history as a modern form of real-world ancestor veneration. So that's me, sorted as a pagan local historian. We'll go back to the old paths. We have two incompatible and uninformed views of rural history. One is that the countryside is a place where little changes, and that reluctantly. I think we all know that's not true, but we still like to think deep down that country wives are still marking a cross in the loaves they put in to bake. And old countrymen still insist on putting a donkey in with the cattle to keep them quiet. And that folklore goes back, way back to prehistory. Well, the other view is that so much has changed that the past is another country entirely, and that is a little closer to reality. Still not quite there, though. We need to think and to look at the links between such perceptions, because landscapes do persist, from standing stones and barrows to roads and trackways. And as you look into them, you realise how persistent paths can be. They have tended to come into being for whatever purpose was at hand by common consent of the community or the manor, or by age-old custom from what Mircea Eliade called illo tempore. We can see that in some of the alignments or so-called lays, as I've explained before here at Mysterious Earth. And once established, they were hard to lose. Fool and Morehouse, in their study of West Yorkshire history, remarked, "It seems probable that the pre-turnpike road network represents a fossilized medieval or even earlier system." And later developments, even enclosure awards, those semi-rational land grabs undertaken by local movers and shakers from the 17th century on, seem to respect them, while not respecting, say, commoners' rights. Now, the persistence of paths in the landscape is important. It's as if they take on a strong personality of their own, that they can resist being pushed aside for local convenience. This may be especially true in the case of corpseways. Perhaps, as Cumbrian local historian and folklorist William Palmer noted in 1915, the official who dared to meddle with the corpse road, even though it might not be used once in 20 years, was in for dire trouble. So what is it about corpseways that gives them this sacrosanct reputation? Now, before I get into that, let's talk some more about their function. Basically, they are the route by which the dead were taken for burial in the parish church, and certain such routes became customary. That's straightforward. But people died in every house and were carried to burial from every house. So I think we have to imagine the network of such funeral paths as a kind of mycelium network like you get with fungi underground, little threads feeding into bigger ones, and it was certain of the bigger routes that developed into the recognised local corpseways. To change the analogy, if you're riding or driving to a major city, there are many routes to get to the trunk road from where you live, but it'll be the trunk road that you aim for ultimately. For one thing, it'll be better maintained and easier going. The trunk road and some of the feeder routes will become recognised as the customary routes, and by virtue of this, get local communal recognition. They become, in other words, what Stuart Dunn has called vernacular routeways, rather than routes that are laid down by some authority. Other vernacular routeways, other things we call desire paths, those paths that run straight across a green space or field rather than stick to the official route around the corner. And in the previous Mysterious Earth, where I talked about desire lines and lays and so on, desire lines are what I suggest as the original vernacular routeways, which led to the alignments that we studied as lays. Anyway, becoming customary also meant that landowners had the responsibility of maintaining them for use, which of course they didn't like, and they didn't always attend to properly, such as they weren't repairing tracks, surfaces or gates. They were allowing them to get overgrown, they were diverting them and so on. We know all this today. But then someone would complain, and that's when we get the mentions in the manorial record. Here are a couple from the Hebden Bridge district, and you can see the penalties that were being imposed for not maintaining a viable causeway. Now there was this legal threat embedded in these paths, therefore, and this became translated in folklore to the belief that land crossed by a corpse in a funeral became a public right of way. But this was never the case as such. The nearest law got to it was to allow a way to church for parishioners to go there for services and back. But that allowance did not confer a legal highway. But causeways became so embedded in custom that they could not be easily rerouted or scrapped, and local people protected what they considered a literally ancestral right, sometimes bloody-mindedly, for as highways improved, a nearby route might become a better one in principle, but only in principle, because whereas modern interests might prefer to follow a least cost and rational paradigm, such as a better road, a better surface, in the vernacular community, ancient custom, as they called it even in 1618, was trumps. Norris and Scatcherd, writing about Morley near Leeds in the 1870s, couldn't reckon it at all. Will it be believed that these good people will not, perhaps cannot, be induced to carry the dead along the road, the nearest highway, but insist on going through grass or peradventure a corn crop, merely because the way through the field is the corpse gate? Rational expectations missed the point that corpseways were not only ancient, they were literally hallowed by the passage of the community's souls. And it is as such that they came to the notice of Earth Mysteries researchers in the 1980s. Corpseways are, of course, not just a British phenomenon, but are found wherever a similar rural parish system operated, and particularly in Northern Europe. It was John Palmer, a keen lay hunter in the Watkinsian tradition, living in the Netherlands, who realised that a lot of the corpseways in his neck of the woods were straight, and of course were aligned on churches. The possible link with lays was obvious, and although most corpseways wandered about according to terrain and were for expedience far from straight for most of their route, when they approached a church, they pulled themselves together and headed straight for it. In the Netherlands, they are known, and I know we've got somebody from the Netherlands here, so please forgive my pronunciation, they're known as Doodwegen or Lichweg. You'll recognise the word lich from our lich gates, where a body rested at the edge of the churchyard before being accompanied by the priest into the yard as a kind of psychopomp. And you may well know the 14th century chant from Cleveland, the Like Wake Dirge, a literally haunting song that was effectively singing the soul home. as in the lyrics, the deceased takes passage from the earthly realm into the realm beyond. It's a kind of local Book of the Dead. Maybe we should hear it, but unfortunately, if you saw Neil and I looking extremely stressed during the lunch break, it was because we couldn't get the music to work. So I apologise for that, and I'm not going to sing it. But can I recommend you to the Young Tradition, Lightweight Dirge? It's on YouTube. If you take a look at the lyrics briefly, you may get this idea that the soul is being taken through the real landscape, and then about halfway through it, it begins to diverge. It begins to take flight into purgatory. And it's a marvellous song. Really do listen to it. Now, in German-speaking areas, their corpseways were Leichenweg, Totenweg, or, and this was a crucial piece of folklore, Geisterweg, the way that ghosts went. The connection between corpseways, alignments, and the other world was therefore made, and that ushered in the most productive and well-evidenced paradigm of alignment research to come out of Earth Mysteries. The idea of spirit roads, liminal paths that are travelled by the soul or the astral, either in out-of-body travel or after death, or in some kind of priestly projection. And once that connection had been made, parallels were unearthed in shamanic cultures around the world. But that is a matter for another day. So, what do we have so far? A network of paths along which dead bodies were taken to church for their soul to be properly cared for and dispatched to the next world by the priest. That means that these routes were sacred routes, and they were so rooted in their communities that people resisted interference with them and laid penalties against those who neglected their upkeep. A belief that these routes distinguished the land they passed over in such a way that they became public rites of passage, even though they didn't necessarily. An acceptance that these were ancient customs by which it is implied that they were seen as ancestral to the local community. Routes which took the departing soul from home to the churchyard were in effect journeys between the worlds, and were a part of the community's ritual landscape, because of course Christianity has ritual landscapes too. There was another, more esoteric reason why the corpseway should not be deviated from. The community knew where they would be going after they died and how. And before the last journey, it was said that the soul of the deceased was set off to reconnoitre the route, to go over it and familiarise itself in the form of what was called a corpse candle, a faint blue flame drifting just off the ground along the anticipated route to the church. If the bearers took the body by a different route, the soul might get lost on the way. Nobody wanted a lost soul floating about, for the sake of both the deceased and the family or community who it survived it. There was law to back up this taboo. If a funeral is brought to the church by any way other than the orthodox corpse road, wrote Henry Penfold in 1907, the house from which the funeral came will be again visited by the reaper within a very short time. As another precaution to such an event, the body was carried out of the house and to the church feet first. So it was facing its final destination. And if it still managed to get lost on the way, it wouldn't be able to find its way home again. And please don't ask, well, couldn't it just turn round? Because folklore doesn't work like that. When confused, ghosts drift like lost psychogeographers. So, of course, you do inevitably get ghosts. In Cumbria, on the Bassenthwaite to Coldback Corpseway, locals knew of a woman dressed in white who used to be seen at Flatley Lenning. Camerton's bleak route near Workington has a grey lady, a white lady, headless horseman, Roman soldiers, and at Camerton Hall, a spectre known as the Bright Boy. At Lowerswater, 3 nuns might be seen carrying what appears to be a shrouded corpse. White figures have been seen along the Lichway on Dartmoor. Audible experiences are also reported, like chanting along corpseways. Now, so far, this is tantalizingly spooky, but pretty theoretical. It's all talk of taboos and ghosts and corpse candles and souls. So once we get out there, we can't necessarily expect to be surrounded by sounds and see white ladies and horsemen and so on like that. But what is it like in the field? As I say, library and map work are first steps, but actual in-person experience, what Christopher Tilley called embodied research, is essential to get a sense of the paths and their place in both landscape and history. Now, you can look for place names, for instance. You're unlikely to find any coffin lanes nowadays. They're not an address that people will find appealing, but you might well find a Kirk Gate, or Kirk Lane, or a Church Lane. These are things you need to look at as a guide. And then, along a possible one-time corpseway, you might come across a home, a house or a farm with this name that offers indirect conjectural clues, not proof, but just clues. Like Lily Hall, near Heptonstall, for instance. This is situated at the junction of 2 known funeral routes. Excuse me. Bear in mind the association of white lilies with death and their use in funerals, and folklore that says white lilies planted in the garden will keep away ghosts, and the name of Lily Hall becomes suggestive. You might also keep an eye out for yew trees, which are of course commonly found in churchyards, but also on corpseways. The yew has long been associated with death, and until the 18th century, its foliage would be laid in the coffin or grave. On the way from Arnside to Beetham in Cumbria, the corpseway goes through an intensely atmospheric yew grove, just before it gets to an equally otherworldly cliff face. But instead of deviating around this cliff face, which would have been quite easy, it insists on going straight up through a narrow cleft known as the Fairy Steps. Another example of encountering liminal and otherworldly entities on these paths. Imagine getting the dead body up that, which, by the way, wouldn't be in a coffin, it would have been on a kind of stretcher bier. More about that in a moment. There were also iron rings set into the cliff face to actually haul the body up. Again, rather than go around it, they had to follow the right path. And now this narrow more indicative in a place name will be the element resting. A party carrying a body across hilly terrain especially will need to rest from time to time. There might be a stone at such a resting place, and it might be called a resting stone or even coffin stone, like the one at Rydal that we saw earlier on the Grasmere Corpseway, or like this one near Hebden Bridge. Often there will be a spring or well of fresh water and a space for mourners to sit. At this one, for instance, you see a wonderful stone to rest a body on, and beside it, just to the right, there's a clearing beside this very clear stream. So an appropriate resting place. And when you're out in the field, you need to think about the path. You have to be mindful as you're walking these paths, and how it might be if you and your companions were carrying a dead body, or indeed if you were being carried yourself. There was a recognised and common sense width in general that the paths needed to be 6 to 8 feet wide. They also tended to be rather circumspect when it came to hills. One of my local paths goes around the jut of the hill towards Heptonstall rather than straight up it, because they're carrying weight. A steady gradient is maintained throughout, if possible, for the sake of the bearers. So these are 3 important characteristics to look out for on a field walk: width, gradient, and suitable resting places. At such places, the procession would pause for a rest, refreshments, a change of bearers, and hymns and prayers. A crossroads and resting place on another Heptonstall Corpseway is still known as Singing Brink, indicating the hymns that would have been sung there. There are 5 running wells there, and 5 paths join, and it's a triangle of land kept apart from the surrounding fields that survived the enclosure awards. It's what's called a no man's land, or Jack's Patch, and they're kept aside for dealings with the liminal, such as the dead, such as the devil, fairy kind, or the local Genius Loki. Moreover, I've found it a fruitful place for a spot of what's called crossroads divination. Now, I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a custom known in many cultures. If something's bothering you, it's a kind of landscape Yijing. If something's bothering you, you go to a crossroads. It's a classical liminal place, of course, and you hold your question in mind, and you sit there. And in due course, people might pass by, chatting, and in the overheard conversation, you may get the answers. You may divine the answers to your dilemma. If the crossroads has or had a standing cross, so much the better. And the implication is that such locations might well be, therefore, on a corpseway, where, of course, there may be an element of spirit communication. Traditionally, though, the best time to do this was around midnight, around the witching hour. But why we don't travel around, we don't walk around at midnight nowadays, but in the past people would be walking more at night, so it wouldn't have been as unlikely as it sounds. Nonetheless, it still works. My own experiences have come home in the daytime. Now, another related divination custom is the midnight vigil at the church gate, the porch, or in the corpseway, where one might clairvoyantly see pass by the wraiths of those in the parish that are fated to die in the coming year. Favoured dates for such vigils were St. Mark's Eve on April the 24th, or the eves of All Hallows, Midsummer, Christmas, or New Year. One church watcher found a hazy form passing that she couldn't recognise. This is up in North Yorkshire. And so she ventured to speak up and to ask its identity. And as you can probably imagine, the response was, "'Tis yourself." Now that might have been a story that was invented to try to discourage such fortune-telling. Now along the way, or at resting places, you might just happen to see graffiti on stones beside the path. And among them might be examples of protective symbols, particularly Marian marks, that two crossed V's across W, invoking the Virgin Mary's protection on the soul and its companions. Here are two examples again around Hebden Bridge. So, how did the dead travel on these paths? As I say, coffins weren't really used, despite the Rydal coffin path. They didn't come into widespread use anyway until the 16th century. And even then, they would have been really inappropriate for a foot funeral over uneven country, because they're heavy and they generally need 6 bearers. So the journeying body was stitched into a stiff canvas bag, a sealed shroud which would resist the penetration of damp and the escape of fumes, and also played a part in the creation of our idea of a wandering ghost dressed in a white sheet. This kit bag could be slung across a horse or strapped to a wooden bier like a stretcher. Such a bier could be carried by 4 bearers and was a lot more forgiving on cross-country paths. You can sometimes find them preserved in churches, such as at Chapel Style in Cumbria, or in folk museums. Sometimes they are wheeled. The priest would meet the party on the final stretch of the route to the church, and the bier stretcher would be placed on top for more stately entrance to the holy ground. Now we already know that sometimes the route chosen might not be the most rational by our modern standards. One corpseway near me crosses a moor that's always been wet, though it also had a recognised bad weather route. Both were difficult, so why were they chosen? And possibly because by either route from their origin, the corpseway would, as quickly as possible, reach a point at which the destination, Heptonstall Church, was visible. And from there, the corpseway follows as far as possible a near direct line of sight. Again, a kind of desire path pattern. And we're back with that to the thing that excited the 1980s lay hunters. And this route has other hints along it. At the point where it sees, at the very point where the route can see Heptonstall Church, it crosses Old Harry Lane. Old Harry, of course, being a nickname for the devil. So is this a warning to keep straight on the right path, to avoid the temptations of being led astray? Folklore would seem to suggest something on those lines. And the corpseway from this point on is called Haven Lane. Its route faces Heptonstall Church and the soul's hopeful, anticipated destination of heaven. So might that, in more superstitious times, pre-Protestant times, as people walked the church with the church constantly before them, would they have been walking on Heaven Lane? Which is better than the by-name for the corpseway from Fryup to Danby in North Yorkshire, which was known as the Old Hell Way. They're a lot more miserable in North Yorkshire than West, I can tell you. Which, incidentally, the old Hellway, that Corpseway, traverses another reference to liminal entities, Fairy Cross Plain. Back to Heptonstall. Further along the Heptonstall route, that's not the one, comes to Dole Lane. Now we must bear in mind how funerals were often accompanied by a dole or a ritual gifting of mourners. And we have 18th century records of children watching from the next farm along for the coming of a funeral party. And what child worth their salt wouldn't keep on watch for the party and then race across a field or two to get a free meal? Nearer Heptonstall, this path links up with another funeral route for the final stretch, a setted track called the Buttress. And on this stretch from Hepton Bridge up to the village of Heptonstall, Robert Dawson was walking home late one night in the 1940s on leave from the RAF when he saw an old man he knew well walking down towards him. He was about to stop for a chat, but his friend walked straight past him without a word. When Dawson got home feeling snubbed, he mentioned to his family that he'd seen this chap and hailed him, but that he'd said nothing, he just passed by. "Ah, it's not surprising," was the answer. "He's been dead for a year." Perhaps they'd forgotten to carry this old man to Heptonstall feet first. Eventually, above Lily Hall, these paths converge on Heptonstall's now ruined medieval village and its graveyard, said to hold over 120,000 souls. In the churchyard is Chantry House, which on renovations in the 1950s was found to have served as a charnel house, holding the bones of the dead that were displaced from graves. On its wall is a plaque depicting a plant in a bowl, which appears to be a Star of Bethlehem, traditionally associated like the lily with death. And yes, the house has a haunting. During renovations, a bricked-up doorway, which turned out to be into the room of the bone store, was opened, and then a painter started seeing a pair of feet and the bottom half of a man walking across the room. Now, these are the kinds of local history and folklore that don't prove anything, but they are indicative of a routeway that today is itself a ghost. So what happened to this ancient custom? I suspect, as I mentioned, that the reason for the popularity of nonconformism in these rural districts was the greater democracy. The church had too many obligations and hierarchies, whereas from a certain point in time, a new chapel could be established, and these too might acquire burial and wedding rites. And crucially, they weren't so far away from one's home. You didn't have to, for instance, if you had to, in the earliest corpseways around Hebden Bridge, you would need to carry the body something like 9 miles over rough ground to Halifax Church rather than Heptonstall. And the church soon saw that this was not to the taste of many of their parishioners. So the chapel might well have been more appealing as a place to be buried. Add to this the Protestant allergy to ritualizing religion, and you have the seeds of change. So our old corpseways will have been dwindling from the 18th century on until new, more accessible procedures utterly replaced the old ways. Now, in my local research in the Calder Valley, I walked and re-walked 4 such corpseways to Heptonstall and to Halifax, checking possible alternative routes, looking for possible resting places or other clues, imagining how it might be to be one of the bearers, and finding out what I could about these old funeral practices. And one thing that surprised me was how often paths really do persist in a landscape, and you can follow the vestige of ancient custom slipping like a spectre through the fields. On my walks, I was taken aback by how even the modern footpaths don't just preserve the line of the old ways, they also preserve the sense, such as when presented with alternatives to join the dots, one can make a good intuitive guess as to what the bearers would have done. By doing this project, prompted by a friend's archive studies and followed up with phenomenological fieldwork, embodied research in the landscape, and informed conjecture, I was able to bring back into local history circles a topic that was highly unfamiliar, but which spoke to an unregarded aspect of social history, which was great. I'm known in Hebden Bridge as a local historian who deals with weird stuff, so it was a good one for the CV. But there was something else too. In all this intensive, mindful walking, over a year or two seeking out the last journeys of my predecessors in the Upper Calder Valley, a sensation grew in me as I walked that I wasn't walking alone, but that I was accompanied by the shades of those who had travelled these routes before. It might have been all in my head, or maybe I was picking up on a remnants in the landscape. They weren't my personal ancestors, but those who had over generations built the community that I've been blessed to call home for nearly 50 years. That was all a rather strange, but affirming and very rooting experience. And is perhaps an integral part of the phenomenological mode of research. As I said at the start, local history, whatever the aspect, mundane or folkloric, is a way of honouring one's ancestors in a place. And now, as a final note, I should say, the word corpseway only describes one perspective, that of us, the living, the companions who bear the dead to their burial. The folklore implies another. It is not a lifeless body that travels there, but the soul saying goodbye. These are sacred roots stretching back to past centuries and forgotten forebears. Through the layered meanings of these roots, they may be largely unknown now, but they played a major narrative role in the life and death experiences of our predecessors. They still live in ambience, and they deserve more recognition from ourselves as our own truly ancestral paths. Thank you.